All right, we're on page 9, and we're section 6, writing transitional sentences. We work each year. I didn't get through this last summer because I was ill, but been a part of the Gap Preaching Camp. We have teenage boys that come in for a week and work with them on teaching them how to write sermons, and then they get to go on Wednesday nights to area congregations and preach. And there are several things for these young guys. Many of them come first time, never preached before, and so there are difficulties for them in trying to write sermons. And there are always a couple of areas that they struggle the most with. One of them that, without fail, every year that I'm there, when we're helping these young guys, is transitional sentences. There is a lot of awkwardness going from one point to the next point for them, and can often be a real struggle. And so I believe that, I think after you've preached for a while, transitional sentences, sometimes I don't even put them in my notes. It just becomes more natural. When you're first starting out, it's hard sometimes. And for these young guys at camp, they often struggle with that. But Lloyd Perry refers to the transitional sentence as a bridge between the proposition and the main points of the sermon. The transitional sentence makes it easier to get from point to point. It also, I would say, helps, I think, your audience to be able to know when you're going from point 1 to point 2 or so on and so forth. I really do believe, I'm a big believer in making sure that that's clear to your listeners so that they don't get confused and say, is he still talking about the first point he started? Where's he at? And we want to have as much clarity as possible. Anyway, the proposition should be connected to the main body of the discourse by questions in a transitional sentence. Interrogatives are why, how, what, when, and where, from Lloyd Perry. Proposition, the statement, the Christian life may be said to be a life of dependence. The question or interrogative, why is the Christian life said to be a life of dependence? And then the transitional sentence, there are several reasons why the Christian life may be said to be a life of dependence. And when you get to that transition, you can just say, reason number 1 is this. And you say it. You get done with explaining your first point. The second reason why the Christian life may be said to be a life of dependence is, and you just keep going. And so it actually allows you to have this real natural flow. And of course, I'm kind of speaking to the choir right now because we got guys who've all been preaching for a long time. So you're probably really good at that. But as you are helping your men in your congregations with learning to preach and helping them, sometimes they'll struggle with that. And the better you are, I don't want to put too much emphasis on this, but the better you are with transitional sentences, really the smoother your message usually goes. It's easier to follow, and that's why they're so important. Anyway, connect each main point by using a transitional sentence, and again, helps your listeners to follow your thought flow, makes the points flow more naturally, identifies your points, lets your audience know when you're moving on from one point to the next, and and you need to make the transitional sentence as simple as possible. Don't make it too complicated and be able to use that. You guys have anything to add to that? All right, let's go on to developing your main points and subpoints, also adapted from Lloyd Perry. The main points should parallel one another in form as far as possible. This will help your memory and that of your listeners. Make sure they are underlined or bold-faced in your notes so you can follow them easily while preaching. Each main point should have only one idea. Try to avoid the word "and" when you're, making whatever your main point is. Don't have an "and" in there because that usually indicates there's a second idea in that. You really don't want that. So arrange your main points in the order they will appear in the text, according to the topic you're presenting, or in order that will help your listeners the most. If you look over at Hebrews chapter 12, and I'm just doing this for the sake of, this is just kind of a really simple thing, but it's just for the sake of illustrating that. In Hebrews chapter 12, if you were preaching on, obviously it is tied to all of chapter 11 and goes on, but if you just look in there, chapter 12, verse 1, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance, the sin which so easily entangles. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author, perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. And then the context goes on from there. But just for the sake of illustration, as far as your main points, if I were doing this, a message from here, I would maybe say, we have four actions that I want you to emulate from our text today. Action number 1 is lay aside. That's action number 1. Action number 2 is run. Let us run with endurance. Action number 3, fix our eyes on Jesus. And action number 4, consider him. So, you can, very simple thing, and you guys probably have a lot of your own ways of being able to do that. I happen to not be a very creative person in that way. My mind doesn't always work like that. I always appreciate guys who are able. One thing I really like about John Mitchell is the way, I mentioned this yesterday, the way he alliterates everything. And it's very creative, the stuff he comes up with. And so do that, but make sure that your main points are that they really flow well and that they give a really strong connection to your text. It's really important to do that. Your subpoints will be the explanation of each of your main points. This might include other information from the text, might include supporting scriptures, also quotes, historic information, illustrations, etc., etc. So when you're developing your main points, this is also, I know with young guys first getting out, this is also a very difficult thing in writing in general, but especially writing sermons is, they'll come up with some main points, then they got to figure out what words to use to describe it and explain it, and that becomes a difficult thing. And but your subpoints, you're kind of filling in your main point, and it's important to be able to do that. It gives, again, that flesh that covers the bones of the skeleton, the outline of your message. Any questions on that? All right. Like I said, we've got all these experienced preachers here. Use of illustrations. This is adapted from Hayden Robinson. I'm going to admit to you, I'm going to go down through this, but I'm going to admit to you that this is a really weak area for me. I'm not always very good at this. But the use of illustrations, a well-placed, meaningful illustration, can be a tremendous help in your message of explaining exactly what you are trying to say. So when you do that, it can help restate, explain, validate, apply the ideas of the sermon by relating them to life experiences. Illustrations can present your main idea and your main points in a different way that will keep the attention of your listeners. They also can aid the memory, stir emotions, hold attention, and establish a rapport between the preacher and the audience. Illustration should throw light on a subject. Don't tell a story just because it's a good one. You ever heard somebody do that? Or tell a joke because it's a really good one, has nothing to do with the message, and it might be right in the middle of the message. It kind of discombobulates the whole thing. And so your illustrations, even if it's humorous, make sure it throws light on the subject. Don't just tell a good story because it's a good one. They should be understandable and convincing, and they should be appropriate. I've already mentioned this once, but no room for crudeness, vulgar language, or off-color stories in the pulpit, bathroom humor, and all that kind of stuff has no place when you get up behind the pulpit. And I know sometimes you'll meet somebody that's just their personality. Well, my advice to them would be change your personality. If that's that's the kind of stuff you like to talk about, you can talk about it when you're at home. Don't do it when you're in the pulpit, and you shouldn't do it at home either, by the way. But anyway, so make sure that they're appropriate. Now, illustrations can come from personal experiences. I'm going to use one tonight in my message that's from a not my personal experience, but someone else. But reading materials, history, sports, life experience of others, etc. One word of caution here. Make sure you do not share information that is shared with you in confidence. And that includes when you're preaching a revival somewhere, Just because you're away from your home congregation does not give you the right to use as an illustration confidential material that's been shared to you by someone back home. So don't do that. Also, don't use personal experiences from church members or family or friends without permission from them. You stay in a place for a long time. My wife and I have been with our congregation since 1994. So the people that we have, we know really well. We know a lot of things about them. They know a lot of things about us. There are some really great illustrations that we can sometimes glean, but I always go and ask permission first. And the reason why, you never want to embarrass someone or end up sharing something that you know about that they never intended, even if it wasn't quote unquote supposed to be confidential. They never expected that to be shared to everybody. Maybe they did something embarrassing, so stay with it. And by the way, that goes for illustrations about your kids too. Make sure that you go. I used Kayla for an illustration some time ago in one of my messages, but I told her ahead of time because I said, hey, can I use you for this? I wanted to share this. She said, yeah, go ahead. So you just need to make sure that you do that when you're using those kinds of illustrations. Any comments on that? All right, we're moving on. Other things to remember. If you quote someone, we've already mentioned this, but we'll mention it again, use an original idea from someone else. Try to always give them credit. If you're not sure where you got a particular quote, illustration, or idea, just say that it's not original with you. I just think that's a good idea. Write your own sermons. Don't just copy other sermons and preach them as if they were your own. That's called plagiarism. You will not grow as you ought to in your knowledge of the Bible or in your skill of preparing messages if you always copy and preach other people's sermons. 4 years ago, at the last presidential election, Jack Cottrell had published, I can't remember if it was in the Restoration Herald or what, but he had published a message on our responsibility in voting. It was really good. So a week or two before the election, I preached that. And I began the message by saying, I'm going to preach a sermon today written by Jack Cottrell because it's really a timely message for all of us. And I said, I didn't write this. And then I went into the sermon. I just wanted them to know that I was using, that may be the only time I've actually done that in, 10, 15, I just don't do that. I think you shortchange yourself if you get on the internet and all you do is copy other people's sermons. You're not going to grow. And I'll tell you what, to be honest with you, you'll probably have trouble getting your church members to grow as well because you won't be growing and it's going to be hard for you to help them to grow. So again, it's okay to use someone else's outline to write your sermon from time to time. Just make sure you give them credit and do this sparingly. Follow the 6 P's of preparation. Pray about your study time, about the passage. This is not in place of your study, but in conjunction with it. Again, you're not praying for illumination. Plan, choose your text or topic. Get a feel for the whole book and its background from which your passage comes. Read the entire book if possible. Read your text in the context it is in many times. Make a list of important words in the text. Study them. Think about your message and the main idea of the passage you've chosen. Put in the necessary time. Study and work hard. Prepare. Write your outline. Add scriptural support, illustrations. Adjust, expand your outline if needed. Produce. Write out your sermon in manuscript form from your outline. And again, I would recommend do this even if you're going to preach from an outline. It'll help you. It's good for study purposes. If helpful or needed, ask for someone else's input on theme, outline, and message. And then edit your message. Make any changes, additions, or subtractions, and rewrite if you need to. One of the things in sermon writing, usually at home, usually when I'm done, I try to be done with Sunday morning sermon by Thursday so that I have the ability to let it sit there for a day and a half or so. Then I can go back to it and see if there's anything I need to edit, change, or whatever. And everything's right there in the computer. And so I do that so that when I get up on Sunday, obviously everything's done, but it's also right in the form that I want it to be. Now, sometimes when you're doing something, maybe you're preaching somewhere else, like the Bible conference, Dave will be speaking. He has to turn in a manuscript. And so what do? You're probably writing all that out, and then you edit that down because it's going to go on a thumb drive, but you want that to be in the exact right form, since other people are going to have it in hand sometime to be able to read that. So there may be a whole lot more editing doing something like that than you would normally do on a Sunday morning. But the fact is, you just need to make sure that you get it into the form that you want. I know guys that they really like doing their sermon writing on Friday and Saturdays. I don't like that. Whatever works for somebody, I like to have that done a whole lot earlier than that. But again, whatever works for them. But the later you wait in the week, the more you're going to cut corners. If you're under the gun to get it done, you're going to cut corners. So try not to do that. Try to give yourself as much time. And you guys know from being in ministry that our week does not, in fact, it rarely goes according to plan. We are one of the few professional occupations where we are literally on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That's the reality of it. So what do you have to do? Well, we have to be disciplined. We have to make sure that we set aside time for our studies, and realizing that there are very likely things going to come up that's going to interrupt us during the week. Practice your message. Read over your message multiple times each day if you can. If it helps, practice delivering your sermon in front of a mirror if needed. And if it helps, practice from the place you will be delivering your sermon. Nothing wrong with doing that. You know, there are guys that I've met before, and they really like to be able to, even guys that have been in the ministry a long time, they like to go and go actually to the church and on a Saturday and preach their sermon right from where they're going to be delivering it. So whatever works for you, just make sure that you do practice and prepare yourself the best that you possibly can. And then, of course, we began with prayer, and we end with that as well. Pray, pray, and pray. This is from George Fall, Helps for Studying the Bible. And I'm just going to mention this, and then, because I think he has some really good thoughts here. Have a place to study where that's all you do. You are immediately in study mode. My office is downstairs in my basement. When I go down there and I sit down in the chair, I mean, that's my place where I'm going to study. And so when I get there, I'm already getting my mind in that mode so that I can get into the work that I'm going to do. And my books are all downstairs, and all of my resources are downstairs, and it is sometimes a little messy, but I mean, I have things surrounding me, and it allows me to get there and just kind of get into it. So have a place to study where basically that's all you do. That's your study place. That can be very helpful. Have a time to study. If possible, set aside specific hours. Again, I know that doesn't always work because of ministry and the nature of ministry. But if you can have a place where that's where you pretty much all you do is study, and if you have a time that you can set aside where that basically is always your time to study, it can be very helpful to have that kind of routine. Now, you guys, does everybody have a church office where you do a lot of your study?
Well, I'm fortunate in that I have an office that's in the building, but I have a study that's out back.
Okay, boy, that is good.
And I have instilled in my people the necessity of allowing me to do what I need to do. And then I'm very fortunate in that I've got an outstanding group of elders that do a lot of the work that a lot of churches expect the preacher to do. So, as I told you earlier, I'm very fortunate because my congregation expects me to do one thing, and that's study the scriptures and teach and preach the scriptures.
Yeah, that's
and they respect my time to do that preparation work, and but not everybody has that set of circumstances.
No, we don't.
I consider myself to be very fortunate.
That is a real blessing.
It is.
And one of the points I was going to make about that is that if you have to have a church office, then you will sometimes have trouble with saying, okay, this is my study time. Because people are coming. We have a church office, but my office, study office, is in my home. So I have actually never had an office in a church building that I used for study purposes. I've never held office hours at an actual building. It's always been in my home, and that is for the purpose of me being able to have my place and my time, and I don't get that interruption as much. So if you have something out back, because you guys, I mean, how often do you people coming through during the course of a weekday when you're trying to get your studies done? Yeah. So Moses, that's the nature of it. And again, it's understandable. People rely a lot on the preacher, but if you have a congregation that understands the need to give you your space, and you have a space where you can go that you're away from everybody, man, what a great blessing.
Well, but you also have to learn how to say no.
I know, and that's hard. I don't know about you guys, that's hard for me to do.
But you have to.
But you have to. I agree. That's a good point. All right, have your tools of study within reach. Again, we've listed all these before, and this is again from George Fall. Have good lighting. Don't study in bed or get too comfortable. That you might want to end up, taking a little nap time. So don't study in bed. Have study breaks if you need them. Exercise or do something active to keep your mind alert and clear. And most of all, be disciplined in study. Put your time in. The study break thing, I'm kind of a somewhat hyper person, and so if I sit down, usually I get up and will need to maybe get up and go get another cup of coffee or something after about 2 hours. I'm just not, I just am a bundle of energy, and I've got to get up and go do something for a few minutes. But Kevin Yeager, Kevin Yeager once said in a message that he sometimes gets lost in his studies. And he said, I'll look up when it was at a seminar thing, he said, I'll look up and 6 or 8 hours has gone by. Man, I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. I've never had that happen. Anyway, but you do need to be disciplined, but you do need sometimes to take a study break if that's something that helps you to be able to do that. All right, anybody have any comments or questions or thoughts? Yes.
What are some things you've observed in yourself or in other preachers when you hear them preach that triggers for you? They should have studied more, they should have prepared more. What are some things that you commonly see when you hear others preach that show they haven't done the homework?
Yeah, I would say some guys, we'll talk here in a little bit about using word whiskers. You ever notice we use a lot of the ums and the you knows? We do that a lot in teaching. When it's informal like this, I've probably used 1 million of them during the last 3 days. But when we get up to formally preach, you need to try to eliminate that. You want the presentation to be without a bunch of ums and you knows and all that kind of stuff. And usually, a lot of times, if I think someone might be struggling, I'll hear more of that. There'll be a lot of hesitation in that. Another thing that is just personally for me, because I've been in the ministry a long time, and I'm not a scholar. I consider myself a serious Bible student, but I'm not a scholar. But having been studying the Bible for a long time, often the very content of someone's message tells me they're not very prepared, because the explanation of their main points are often very choppy. There's not a whole lot of continuity, and sometimes not very much insight. So in my opinion, most of the time, if I think someone's maybe hasn't put their time in, it usually has to do with their content. Nerves play a big factor for some guys. And that causes them to struggle. I tell people embrace the nervousness. I don't have a big issue with that, but embrace the nervousness and don't let it be the thing that, allow it to channel it to help you to focus better. But I do know that sometimes nervousness just comes into it. It's not a matter of maybe they have fully prepared, but it's hard for them to get going. And of course we laughed about don't apologize. Chris and I were doing that last night because he apologized for a song, and it was very humorous to do that last night at the revival. But we talk about those apologies. And one of the reasons why is I think when you start apologizing for things, you do set yourself up for some failure. And a fellow, a number of years ago at one of our gatherings, it was his first, he was actually, I think, probably maybe in his 60s. I don't remember what his name was, but he got up to speak, and it was his first time to ever be in a venue like that. And the first thing he said was, I can't tell you all how nervous I really am right now. I'm just really nervous. Well, when he began his message, he fumbled over a couple things. A page blew off and kind of fell. He had to reach out and pick it up. He never got back on track. And I don't remember what he preached, because the whole time I was just praying, Lord, please help this guy to get back. But he kind of, when you say I'm nervous, or when you apologize, you're setting yourself up for some failure. Don't do that. Just get up there and preach. And if you are nervous, fake it like you're not. Just get up there and do your best for God. You have something?
Well, another question then, for guys that preach on a fill-in basis, they have a full-time job, families, etc. What advice would you give them as far as preparing, setting aside time?
Start early. If you have, and a lot of the times when you schedule guys, because I know you let other fellows do preaching here, when you schedule them, how far out do you let them know normally?
At least 6 months.
Okay, so here you go. Usually that's going to be the case. My brother-in-law Al preached for me this past Sunday. He knew that a couple of months out. I talked to him about that 2 months ago. So guess what? His sermon was all done long before. In fact, he brought me a page of it about 3 or 4 weeks ago and said, hey, tell me what you think about the thoughts I have down on this. He was preaching from the book of James. And so he was already way into that because I gave him. That would be my advice. Start early. Now, obviously, something may happen. The preacher might get sick. You might need somebody to jump up real quick. My advice to them would be, when you're not preaching, say, hey, I don't have to preach for 6 months. Start writing a sermon. Anyway, keep sermons on hold just in case there's a situation. And if you are prepared and you have all of that done, it will help you immensely if something happens and you have to preach, quote unquote, on the spur of the moment with only a day or two's notice, or maybe even a few hours notice. So that would be my advice. Start early. And when you're not preaching, and not anytime soon, start writing a sermon anyway. Come up with some ideas and start writing sermons, and keep sermons in a file that will allow you on a moment's notice, if you have to get up, grab that, and be able to preach. So that would be my advice. Just start early for guys who don't have a lot of experience. If a person is a procrastinator and they put it off a lot, it's going to make it a whole lot harder. And I'll tell you, I think they'll be more nervous when they get up there. They'll have nerves anyway, but they'll be more nervous if they don't feel prepared. So that would be my advice. Start early.